Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to try and dig deep into the myths or the truth about the 10 degrees downward tilt. 10 degrees downward tilt was recommended by Still back in the early 90s, and they moved away from it. But from what I understand, the geometry of the side plate and the tooth, the geometry of the tooth in general, was a little bit different than what it is today. So they called for 10 degrees downward tilt, and it said to thin out the edge. That was the term that they used. Plus it would reduce the, if you had too much hook. So that's what always I remember that they said. That's why you use 10 degrees downward tilt. So what I'm going to do today is this tooth here, the red one. I'm going to use the Still's file guide, which is this unit here. And I'm going to file that at 90 degrees horizontal. The blue tooth, I'm going to file that. I'm not going to do 10 degrees downward tilt. I'm going to do a little bit more, maybe 12, 13, 14, something like that there, a little bit steeper, so that I can see the results a little bit more. So, yeah, that's what I want to do. And I want to compare the results to see how much difference it really makes. And there's a lot of companies that still recommend 10 degrees downward tilt, and there's a lot of companies that don't. Now, the other thing that is, and look, I don't know what the thickness of when they stamp these cutters out, they're made of a certain thickness. I don't remember what they were 20, 30 years ago, but I've measured these, and the thickness is about 1.5 millimeters, and then obviously the top plate, it thins out towards the edge. I believe that Oregon have a thinner tooth. That could be the reason why they recommend 10 degrees downward tilt on certain chains, because if you've got too much hook and there's not enough metal to support that hook, in hardwood or frozen wood, you're going to damage that edge or that point fairly quickly. It's going to go dull really quickly. And I've even seen with too much hook that the point can bend over a little bit. I've never witnessed that in modern times, even with a little bit too much hook using a steel chain. So yeah, look, I believe Still really do make really good chains and the right thickness. So I really can't say anything bad about them whatsoever. As far as I'm concerned, Still make, if not the best chain in the world. That's my opinion, and I think there's lots of other people would agree with that Still make one of the world's best chain. Now that tooth there, this is a Still chain, RS, full chisel. So what we're going to do now, we're going to file this one, and we'll compare the pair. Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of experiments with this 10 degrees downward tilt as opposed to 90 degrees flat filing. So all the 90 degrees, I use the file guide. That way there's no disputing inaccuracies through freehand filing. But if you freehand filing, you're bound to make little mistakes. And that's quite normal. Now what's interesting, this is interesting, if we look at the first picture up in the top left hand corner, this is going to show you 90 degrees standard filing using the Still file guide. And this is a nice shape. This shape here, there's plenty of metal support underneath the top plate cutting angle, the top plate's got lots of support. It doesn't have an aggressive angle. It really doesn't need any tilt. And I think this is why still don't recommend on their RS full chisel any tilt or tilt in a lot of chains, because the way that their chains are designed and built and the thickness of the metal, it's got enough metal support there. It's got all the right geometry. It doesn't need 10 degrees downward tilt. But I do believe it's got a slight little bit of tilt on it, about 5 degrees at manufacture, because I've sort of put the file using the FG2 file guide system. I laid the file into the profile of the tooth and changed the setting so to get it as close as possible. And 5 degrees tilt married that profile as rather than 0 degrees or 90 degrees flat. So I do believe that it's got a little bit of tilt in it, and that's not going to hurt. Okay, so I thought I'm going to try 15 degrees tilt, because I really want to see the difference between no tilt and, yeah, sometimes you can't see everything with your eye, because we're talking about a little tiny tooth here. So I really wanted to see the difference. And if we look at the picture, top left-hand corner, that's got the 15 degrees tilt, as best as I could judge 15 degrees. And you can clearly see it's got a reduced hook. Now, the other thing that's interesting, I checked the side plate, and I've checked everything. And the conclusion is, when they talk about thinning out the top plate, you will thin out the top plate, or the top plate, if you look at the thickness of the top plate. So if it was 90 degrees, let's just say that the top plate had a thickness right in the corner where the top and the side meets, right in that corner, it was 1.5 millimeters in thickness at 90 degrees. As you change the slope, that thickness will increase. As I said before, if it's 1.5 millimeters in thick, depends on the angle that you have, the top plate cutting angle, the length over that cut or that angle will either increase or decrease, depends on the angle. And there it is there. So I roughly, now when you measure with one of these tools here, this is fairly rough. I wouldn't rely on this to be the most accurate thing in the world, but it is very, very difficult to measure and get a really accurate number without proper magnification and proper equipment, which, yeah, obviously I don't have. So the end conclusion is when they talk about if you can reduce the hook, the more hook that you're going to get, that top plate will have a steeper angle. So if this angle, as I was saying, if you were to look at this distance to here, it's 1.5 millimeters. As you tip over, this angle gets longer, because the distance from the top of the top plate to the bottom of the top plate will be longer, because it's got further distance to go because of the angle. So the thinning out, as what they say, is true, but it's only around about 5%. 5%, looking at a tooth, and if we were to look at this tooth here and turn around and say that the thickness based on the angle is only 5%, 6% difference, you're not going to pick that up with your eye. It's just not going to pick it up. Not with a slight bit of tilt. Now, 10 degrees tilt, no, you're not going to see it. So it is true, it does thin it out or reduce the thickness slightly, very slightly. And the reduced angle, by running a file through with 10 degrees downward tilt, you reduce the C shape and you reduce the hook. And every chain could be slightly different. And the other thing that has a big influence on all of this, if it's freehand filing, is depends if you can keep your file 20% above the top of the tooth. Now, some other interesting information has come about. On the FG2, for some reason, and I don't know why, and even on the FG3, they're quoting that the file is kept 10% above the top plate. Then there's a PDF that still have put out. It's about filing and that. I think it's about 10 megabytes in size. And there's a graphic icon on there, and it shows a file and a tooth, and it's got 25%. I'm thinking, how do you go from 10% to 25%? That's going to change the side plate geometry, and it's going to change the top plate angle quite a fair bit. So, yeah, look, I'm a little bit baffled sometimes when Still put something out or don't put something out or don't explain it properly. That's the other problem that you've got. And one manufacturer will say use a 5.2 millimeter file on a 3/8 chain, and others will say a 5.5 millimeter. So I know it's only 0.3 of a millimeter, but every manufacturer can say something a little bit different. And the worst part about that is that if you're a newcomer to this game and you're reading one thing, just say you do a Google search, and you're reading one thing that's telling you 10 degrees downward tilt. And then if you look at Still, there is no tilt. So you're going, oh, I wonder what's going on there. And that's where so much mass confusion comes from, that people sometimes don't know what they should be doing. But I think it's really bad that if you've got a FG2 file guide system and Still in the manual are quoting 10% to have the file 10% above the top plate angle, and then they put out a PDF and they're quoting 25%. I don't know. That's really going to, even to me, as a person that's been in this game for over 20-something years, that's, I don't know about that. That's really throwing a curved ball. But the main thing is, I know how to sharpen and what angles to keep and what cuts good. And that's why, for me, I prefer Hexa. Hexa is pretty straightforward. You don't have to worry about the file being in this spot. You just don't have to worry about 10 degrees downward tilt. It's a hexagonal file. It works fantastic. You can't make a mistake. And if you've got a grinder and you grind the wheel profile or shape the wheel profile to the correct shape, you won't have a mistake. So pretty much I can understand why Still don't have the 10 degrees downward tilt, because their thickness of their tooth, the actual metal that they stamp the tooth out, is thick enough that it can support a bit of hook. I wouldn't be worried about that. So if you looked at those two pictures, and we'll just show the picture without hook again. If your tooth looks like this, don't even worry about 10 degrees downward tilt. Now, someone turned around and said that Oregon chain is thinner in thickness. That could be the reason why they have 10 degrees downward tilt. Okay, so what we've got here is 3 chains. Now, we've spoken before about the thickness of the chains, what the material is that they're stamped out of. And if you have a look at this, and hopefully I'll give you a couple of seconds, pick one that you think that's the thickest in width. If you pick the one on the left, you'd be right. The one on the left is a Still. The one in the middle is an Oregon full chisel. And the last one on the right-hand side is Oregon semi-chisel. Now, we'll take them off and measure them, but typically when I measured the Still, I was around about 1.4 millimeters, 1.45 millimeters in width. And on the Oregon, I was about 1.25 millimeters. So there's about 0.2 of a millimeter difference. So we'll take off the semi-chisel, and You can see that it's an Oregon chain. Reason I've kept it, it's... I'll just zoom back out here. And we'll measure. Now, where are we? Just got to trying to do two things at once. It's saying 1.21. As you can see, that's the Oregon. Okay, so that's that one. Now this one, as you can see, it's a Oregon chain. There's the Oregon stamp, a little bit hard to, there it is there, Oregon. And just measure another one. $1.19. Okay, so then we'll measure the still, which is this one here. This is the still, the RS 3/8 full chisel. Just sort of that one's 1/3/8. Good. And we'll just measure this one here. This one's showing 157. Just measure another one. The averages that I've been finding is sort of, this one's 1.42. Just measure one more. But as you can see, definitely the Oregon's thinner. So the conclusion is, while you may see a manufacturer recommending 10 degrees downward tilt, most likely if they're recommending 10 degrees downward tilt, it's probably because they've got a thinner cutter. I haven't measured the tie straps. They could also be thinner. So, but as I said, I suspected that may have been the case, that they're stamping, when they stamp out the tooth, the thickness of the metal is different on Oregon and it's different on Still, and it may be different on Charlton, Archer. All the different brands could be slightly different. They're going to be close, but definitely you can probably see why. Now, I don't know, I've got no idea why that Oregon chain is about 0.2 of a millimetre thinner. But you can certainly see that having a thickness of around 1.45 millimetres in thickness will hold a better support underneath the tooth on the working corner. So if the working corner has more metal underneath it, it will certainly support a little bit of hook. And I guess that's my point. Okay, so I just measured the Husqvarna X-Cut C85, and the width of the side plate is about 1.2 millimetres, so that's much thinner again than the Still. This chain here is a Hurricane chain. It's about 1.2 millimetres width on the side plate as well. So they're all stamped out of, you measure it across on the rake is probably a good spot to measure it as well, because it's fairly flat there. But it's all stamped out of, this would be 1.2 millimetre metal sheet, and they stamp millions of them out. And then they're pressed, formed, hardened and chromed and everything else. But it's sort of leading me to the conclusion of just Husqvarna and Oregon and Hurricane all measuring around the 1.2 millimeter thickness, and Still's measuring around about the 1.45 millimeter thickness. Almost come to the conclusion on full chisel that anything that's probably got a thickness of 1.2 millimeters, and you could measure the raker if you've got a pair of calipers, but if you've got anything around about 1.2 millimeters, it would probably benefit, even if it was 5 degrees tilt. Doesn't have to be 10 degrees, it could be 5 degrees tilt. A little bit of tilt, or alternatively, if you don't want to do that, make sure that your file, and as I said, this is controversial and this is a little bit puzzling as to why now Still are saying hold your file a quarter of the diameter above the tooth. That's certainly going to give you a very strong working corner. Yeah, look, that's a bit of a curve ball for me. So, yeah, maybe Al Palaco can answer that one. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye for now.